Hello, everyone. We're your hosts, Beth Orr
and Bridget Corns.
And welcome to Click Moments and Passionate Pursuits, the Unfolding, where intuitively guided conversations are followed with feral faith, enthusiasm, and joy, bringing new insights, inspiration, and perspectives along the way. And today we're mixing things up. We're doing things different. We've decided to invite a special guest who is somebody that Bridget has a special relationship with and has known for a while. And so I'm going to ask Bridget if you can introduce our guest and get our conversation going.
Absolutely. So we are approaching this conversation from two very different postures as it relates to the topic of spiritual direction. So our special guest is my spiritual director, who I've known for about a year now, Dave Barszewski. And he is based up here in Rochester, New York, close to me, and works through the Assisi Institute in Rochester. And we are roaming into the topic of an evolutionary perspective on spirituality and its intersection with the practice of spiritual direction. So I think what would be an appropriate way to start this conversation is that I'm sure there are plenty of people who aren't even familiar with what spiritual direction is. So, Dave, if you want to get us started and just dig into that first, that would be beautiful.
From my perspective, spiritual direction is walking with a person, being a companion, and listening with them for the voice of the Spirit in their life. So from my end, it very much involves listening and listening to the person who's the directee. Sitting in the quiet with it and responding with whatever comes.
So can you tell us? Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, this is going to be a new thing for us. We
Right?
both have questions bubbling up. You go.
My thought was just around. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came into being a spiritual director?
Okay, it's a long path. Where do I start? So in the mid-70s, I went to seminary, and although I have a Catholic background, I'm a Baptist minister. And round about 1975, I came across some of the early books returning back to the ancient practice of spiritual direction and got interested. Although before that, there was a Protestant text from the 1890s called Waiting on God, which I had read earlier. And so since that was actually the main text was a soul called Soul, S-O-U-L, Soul Friend, published in 75. And so I've found spiritual directors for myself since that time. Then I pastored churches from 1977 right through up to the last day of 1989. And from that point became an addictions counselor. So there's a lot of crossing between counseling and spiritual direction and pastoral direction. And in that AA, it's such a big part of recovery from addictions. There's that whole bit of spirituality. So if you will, those are the interweaving strands over the last several decades. And then I guess most recently, let me think now. 11 years ago, I started attending the Assisi Institute in Irondequoit, New York. And several years ago, the director and his wife were doing all the spiritual direction at the Institute, and it got to be more than they could handle. And so he decided to create a team of spiritual directors. just, he had the Catholic background on one side, and he's Richard Rohr, who's rather famous, is his spiritual director. And he's also involved in the Kriya Yoga of Yogananda. And his mentor in that realm is a direct disciple of Yogananda. So he has those two streams meeting. He also has a master's of psychology and does psychological counseling. So he's got those strands. Anyway, he asked me if I'd be interested in being a spiritual director, and he provided a training for a small team of us. And then, to my surprise, when the training was done, he said, "This is more than I can handle," and he asked me to be the supervisor of the spiritual directors. So I guess that's my story.
Beautiful. And you know, one of the things we like to do early on is really help the viewers be able to understand how what we're talking about is relevant to them, and how to really be listening to our conversation so that they can begin to see themselves in what we're talking about. And so as you were talking, there's so many potential ways to start this with, but there's just when you described this, I just kept feeling more and more relaxed and soft, like when you said companion, and walking alongside them and listening. These are very feminine qualities, right? And I felt this, you know, I was thinking about my own tradition and how early on you either went to church or you didn't. So you were either in church getting some sort of a group discussion about what existed out there, and there was one particular viewpoint, or you were on your own trying to figure this out. So to me, in the last 15-20 years, this concept of spiritual direction, this, like you described, like having somebody one-on-one walk alongside you with this, is such a beautiful concept that I don't know that everybody in our culture really understands as an opportunity. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, somebody who's rather new to this topic, what kinds of things do you see bubbling up in people as they're really coming in for spiritual direction, and how might one, what might one be considering that it would be an entry point, or accessing? Why might they consider accessing spiritual direction?
Okay. I think the first thing I would say is I've been doing this for a while now, and no two directions are the same. They're all totally unique and different experiences. Formulating my thought. If you have an interest in being one with the universe, or being one with God, or being one with your planet, or with the people you live with, and as part of that, you want to connect with your deeper self, listening to the inner voice. And I also would an intent of, how could I be a more loving being in this world? How could I come to experience the community, the communion that we're moving toward? Maybe just simply, how do I understand myself better? Or another question is, how can I sit into silence and just listen for God? Oh, that reminds me, one thing that I can say is a very common experience across all the directions I've done. people come with questions or thoughts, and I explore their thoughts or their questions. And I discover that they have the answer they're looking for. And sometimes I think my biggest job is just affirming, confirming for people what they've already learned for themselves. And having that outside voice say, that sounds like it, seems to make a big difference.
That's beautiful. I think that there's so much doubt about what people are experiencing inside because of the invisibility of the experience. And I believe that, so often we're used to being told what we believe when it comes to spirituality. So it feels like it's a little discombobulating to many people to be in a position, and I would even dare say a bit sacrilegious for some people to contemplate for themselves what the experience with the divine feels and looks like. So what you're describing is something that's very counterintuitive to many people given their upbringing.
Let me throw in something here.
Mm-hmm.
So I did addictions counseling for 27 years. And I worked for county agencies the whole time, almost the whole time. So I worked with the people who couldn't afford to go to the fancy agencies. A lot of blue collar, lower socioeconomic. It's sometimes I get the impression that the elite think they've got it together, and people who haven't their education or whatnot don't have the insights they do. My experience over hundreds of people over 27 years is everybody goes deep. Addiction forces you to deal with your spirituality. I think people with addictions are among the most spiritual people in the world. And if you read through AA, it's this wonderful spirituality. And so what I've discovered is people think about their lives and they have good understandings. Oh, and one thing, they're mowing the lawn at the community center next door.
We can't hear anything, so that's good.
Oh, good. I did was I normally have a jacket on when I'm counseling and have index cards in my pocket. If the person says something I really need to hear, I'll pull the card down and write it down, because otherwise I'll be sitting there trying to remember that as opposed to listening to my client. And so I just write it down and put it down. They say, what did you just do? I said, what you said is really important to me, and I didn't want it to interfere with my thoughts, so I'm just writing it down so I can look at it later.
Beautiful. Mm-hmm.
I was thinking that one of my experiences being a spiritual directee, I came to Dave at a point where I was trying to figure out how to put together my own personal spirituality based upon the traditions that I was raised in, the traditions that I had chosen and left, and the experiences that I was having with God that were unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my life outside of those traditions. So I grew up always having a close relationship with God, but then I was fed the idea in churches that I wasn't allowed to have a personal relationship with God. It had to go through some kind of a mediator. And that really watered down the experience for me. And then in my 30s, I started to recognize things and see things and hear and feel things that I hadn't before. And like Beth said, they were kind of discombobulating. And it was like, I think God is trying to get my attention and tell me something. And I reached out because I was really confused, a little bit scared, kind of excited. And just wanted someone to partner with, really, if for nothing else, than to be able to say, you're not alone. This isn't as unique or strange as you think it is. And also, here's some reading you can do. Here are some ideas. Let's walk this together and see where we go. And I think that really starts to dip into this evolutionary idea of spirituality, that it's unique, that it's individual, and that we're each evolving along a course together, but separately as well. Beth, I see you taking notes. Do you have thoughts?
I do. Sorry, I was trying to get off mute. I have so many thoughts, but I mean, number one of the things that you said really struck me, and you were talking about, basically, if we come from this faith background where we're taught that we need a mediator, then we really start to distrust, our personal experience, right? Because we're told that it can't be trusted, right? And so instead of nurturing and deciphering or even just experiencing what is coming up within us, we tend to tamp it down. Or at least I can say that's been my personal experience in the past, is to, if you believe that it's not something that you can trust, kind of tamp it down. So just number one, I just wanted to kind of throw that out there. But I also, I'm really curious. We're talking about this evolutionary approach, and that's really something that I would say in the last like 6 or 7 years I've really been exploring, instead of this static, fixed belief system that I should understand more deeply, and that I don't. It's like it's very fixed, and it's like I have to try to figure out all the things that I don't know. This feels very generative. It feels very expansive. This other concept, this evolutionary approach, where everything is within me, and then more is kind of coming around me, that is almost, although everybody has access to it, it feels like what my unique relationship with the divine, like I'm sensing something different than you might be sensing, and that's right for me, right? So I don't know if this makes sense, but it's just kind of bubbling up for me, and I'm wondering your thoughts. I really am interested in what your thoughts are on this personal evolving relationship that we have, that's so uniquely ours, but yet comes from the same deep well.
It's a string of things you said. My first thought was, if you can't trust your own experience, you can't really trust anything. And the second thought was, but self-doubt comes just so naturally. And right, I think it's all of us. We know something right now. We've had this experience. There's no doubt about it. We've had it. We know it. It's real. 17 minutes later, was that real? Did I make that up? It's just how we operate, apparently. And that's the point at which a spiritual, let me just say, a spiritual friend, it doesn't have to be a director, listens to your story and says, sounds real to me. And I liked what you said about, we each have our own experience, our own connection to the divine, our own connection to each other. I might add, if you can think of any relationship you have, it's different than every other relationship you have, because the two together create something new. That is just that experience. And I do believe in God, and I do believe that God is communicating with all of us all the time. We all get a piece appropriate to us, so that the truth is something we have together. The more different opinions or more different experiences we have in the room, the more likely that we will more closely approximate the truth together. So more than just a one-on-one relationship, community becomes really important. And on the one hand, you want to say a community of like-minded people, but on the other hand, you want a community of people who think totally differently, because that's the only way we get to a more expansive, holistic knowledge of God and of our relation with each other. So I've lost all the questions. Did I answer it?
Yes, and I think it's beautiful where you just left off, because I think it fits really nicely with something that's kind of a couple of concepts that kind of come together with this. I've really been thinking a lot about how much people have been suffering on the other side of COVID, and certainly we still have COVID present in our lives, but it's definitely evolved itself. And people are really craving community. They're craving communion so deeply, but there's such a divide. And in this world where there's certain taboo topics that we can't talk about, and spirituality is unfortunately in many places one of those things that we can't discuss, how do we create a community that is inclusive and encouraging of different unique experiences when it's counterintuitive to the culture? The yeah.
So my first thought is that the desire for communion may be the fundamental basic human need. There are always exceptions to everything, but I think it's something virtually every one of us experiences. Sometimes we gather in like-minded communities just because it's easier. But it goes deeper if we're in communities where there's difference and we learn how to listen to each other. And how to do that. There are trainings. There are communities. From what Bridget has told me is what the two of you are trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to remind me, Bridget, I told you about a book by Parker Palmer. What was the title of that?
A Hidden Wholeness.
A Hidden Wholeness.
I was just thinking of that when you were talking about this.
He's
Beautiful.
a Quaker, and he's written this book on how to have communities of trust. And there are many guidebooks out there, but that's one excellent one. You know, decades ago, there was a book called The Road Less Traveled by Scott Peck, which was like on the bestseller list for 13 years, I think. After that book, he wrote a second book called A Different Drum, or The Different Drum, which wasn't nearly as well received. That says something about us. The first book was really about individual spirituality. The second book was about community. And it's actually quite a good book. Actually, Peck might have a Quaker back. I'm very impressed by Quakers. And there are, there's other groups that talk about, passing the peace pipe, or some emblem that passes the peace pipe. Then trying to be culturally sensitive, we do something that's not passing, not trying to appropriate each other's culture, but they're out there. I am most encouraged by communities that live in community and live what appears to be, I guess the phrase I'll use is a spiritual life. One that I've been most impressed by is the Bruderhof community,
Okay.
which ironically has most of its communities right here in New York State. Whoever started in 1920 in Germany. And due to the Nazis, they were forced to leave Germany and transplanted to mostly to New York, but they're in South America and whatnot. They have an Anabaptist background, which puts them in the same stream as the Mennonites and the Amish, except their community is more conversant with the modern world. But they live together, they share resources, they have communal evening meals. They go off to their various jobs or not, because if they're called to do something else, the community will support them in whatever their nonprofit calling is. And they respond to needs around the world. But there's a book called Another Life is Possible. So in 2020, it was their 100th anniversary, and they published a book with 100 vignettes of people who joined their community. And it's a wonderful book. And I just read the vignettes because it gives me hope that there's somebody somewhere actually doing this. And I think that's we're going in the future, but it can get awfully discouraging at how slowly it seems we're getting there, if you pardon my, but
I wonder how these individual intentional lives affect the collective, whether it's maybe not directly, because many of us haven't heard of these specific instances, but it feels like in the last few years, I mean, I certainly understand that we're all affecting each other, we're all interconnected. And so I'm wondering, whereas it might not seem like this is making a huge difference other than to themselves, if that's actually not true, and there's some way that this is contributing to, just even energetically, giving the collective some hope.
that would be my starting point. I do believe we're all connected, and we're all connected through a common consciousness. I call that common consciousness God myself.
Mm-hmm.
And every thought each one of us adds to that consciousness. And we're all receivers. So on some level, we're all kind of plugging in. And I might add, so I believe in reincarnation. And each life we're in the process of becoming ourselves, and it takes many lives. But in the book God in Autobiography, the person who's hearing God says, well, what if we fail at our life task? I'm paraphrasing. And he hears God say, well, there's really no failure, because you learned something. And if you learn something, then the universe has learned something. And if the universe has learned something, I, God, have learned something. Because in this book, God reveals God as an evolving God who is growing along with us. Or maybe I should say we're growing along with God. Or on a more direct level, people stumble across these communities, and it makes a difference. One of my favorite stories is from a woman who was a Manhattan intellectual. Atheist, probably it's 1930s, so she's probably a communist or, whatever. And someone invited her to go visit this community upstate from New York City. So it's like 50 miles upstate, I live upstate. It's 300 miles. But anyway, so she went, she said, yeah, I'm just going. She wore the most provocative dress she could wear. And went there, and she was just gonna show up the system. And she writes this article and said, they just accepted me. And it was a wonderful, loving atmosphere. And eventually she joined the community.
Mm. Mm.
I'm not too sure if it's the right word, but AA doesn't preach, it just spreads by contagion.
Mm.
I think they have a better word for than that, but I'm getting old and I don't remember words so well anymore.
I was just going to chime in that this is the book that we're referencing, God and Autobiography as Told to a Philosopher by Jerry L. Martin. And
Okay.
as you can tell from you can't even see the notes inside of it, but this along with A Hidden Wholeness was one of the first books that Dave recommended I pick up. And oh my gosh, I think every chapter or so I was in tears. It just felt very confirming to me to read some of the questions and thoughts that I had been having, that I felt like, gosh, I feel like these are pieces of information that God is trying to communicate to me. But I don't have any way to back that up or confirm that. And then I read in this book, which really the short, very short abridged version of it is that Jerry doesn't really believe in God. Was he an atheist or an agnostic?
I think would be a better word.
Yeah. And praise and thanks God for his partner that God brought into his life. And in his prayer of thanksgiving, God answers out loud. He can hear the voice of God. And it develops into this relationship where God asks Jerry to tell his story. And yeah, Dave can take it from here.
I may just jump at that to say that I went to a Catholic high school in the 1960s, which had a lot of Jesuits as teachers and the Sisters of St. Joseph. But I was introduced to the evolutionary spirituality of Teilhard de Chardin, a Catholic priest who was a noted paleontologist, and to the process philosophy of Alfred Lord Whitehead. Then down the line, I ended up in seminary, but I was always looking for a process understanding of God, because it seemed like that would be the way to go. So in the 1970s, process theology was quite the thing. I read everything. None of it felt right. It just wasn't, I had a feel for, like, this should be developed. And the people, I wasn't getting what I wanted until in 2016, in the New York Review of Books, I saw, they have that page in the center with like 5 million little books on it, that you might, and I'm looking at them just because I scanning them and I see God and autobiography, and I'm like, okay, I got to buy that. I don't know what it is, but I got to buy that. And it's the book. It's the book I'd been looking for 50 years at that point.
Mm.
And I just wanted to throw in a side note. Bridget is such a hoot as a spiritual directee. I swear. No, we're talking and something comes to mind and I always reference it. So I'll make a quote, and like I did today, I'll say, I got it from this book, and just let that pass. The next session, Bridget says, I read the book. Every time.
The entire thing.
The entire thing. Yeah. And some of these aren't easy reads.
Well, I've not made it through Tomberg yet.
Yeah, he's a tough one.
it's really a lot to chew on. But yes.
So that's interesting. That's interesting. So tell me more about that, Tomberg. Like, if you're a voracious reader and you're taking everything in and you want it all, what is it about this one that rubs up against you, and what makes it yeah, just talk a little bit more about that, especially since I don't know the connection between Dave and that book.
You want me to say something? Let me go back here. I go to the Assisi Institute, and it's a blend of Eastern and Western spiritualities. And Kriya Yoga of Yogananda is the main pillar at Assisi Institute. And his teachings are a large part of what the Institute does. I need to throw in, it's the Assisi Institute, so you might guess that St. Francis is a big part of this. But the text that the director had picked for going deeply into the Western tradition was this book called Meditations on the Tarot, anonymously written by Valentin Tomberg. It's a book I never would have read. The title would have put me off. And anyway, he recommended it, so I started reading it. And I went through it. And he has since asked me to teach a course on Tomberg, which I am doing currently. The book is primarily a book of understanding spirituality, have an evolutionary understanding of spirituality. And it dovetails remarkably with God in autobiography. Also, I found an index to the book online. The most quoted person in the book is Teilhard de Chardin. By the way, God also references Teilhard de Chardin in God in autobiography. Teilhard's a bit of a heavy slog too. Not as bad as Tomberg. So
is he the one that's quoted with the quote, we're spiritual beings having a human experience, or is that somebody else?
I don't know. I've heard that, but
Okay.
I don't know where the connection is.
I'm sure Bridget's looking it up.
In terms of process thought, we can go back to the beginning of the 20th century and Whitehead, and either Bergman, I believe. But from the 1930s on, in the Western tradition, we had Teilhard de Chardin writing his spiritual evolutionary theology, which the Catholic Church banned him from publishing. So he kept the manuscripts and gave them to a friend, and they weren't published until after he died. So they started appearing in 1957. But at the same time as he was writing, there was a man named Sri Aurobindo, who was writing an evolutionary perspective of spirituality from a Hindu perspective, a yogic perspective. So they were simultaneously, it doesn't look like either one of them had a chance to read each other. But so if we're talking about a common consciousness coming to the surface. And Tomberg is exquisitely familiar with all these predecessors. And he deeply studied the yogic system also. And in some ways, the general outline of his book is really like a Western version of, I don't know, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I don't know if you're familiar with that, which is your basic introduction to yogic practice. So in the very first chapter, Tomberg starts with quoting the beginning of Patanjali. yoga is the cessation of the vibrations or the oscillations of the mind. And that's what the first chapter is about. And he starts off by citing the yamas and the niyamas, which are the first two limbs of the first two steps of yoga praxis, where in the process of renunciation or detachment, we come to a place of silent stillness, if you will, quieting the desires of the ego, so we can open ourselves up to the will, the love, the desires of God. So just to show you the analogy that is tracking closely from the beginning.
Beth, you were spot on with that. The quote is, "We are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We're spiritual beings having a human experience." Pierre Teilhard de Chardin.
Thank you for checking. That's my limited knowledge of him.
In an article called "The Heart of the Matter," which is published in a collection called "The Heart of the Matter," Teilhard de Chardin says that as we're evolving and moving forward, matter is evolving into spirit. They're not two different things.
Can you talk more on that? I'm like my mind is like.
Well, yeah, I just, due to a series of coincidences, The Heart of the Matter came up, and I said, I read that, but I don't remember what it's about. So I just recently reread it. Well, can I grab it off the shelf?
Please.
I was talking to a friend about Tomberg. We were actually discussing one of his cards analysis. And he was quoting Teilhard de Chardin, and I didn't recall this exactly. But she said, yes, The Heart of the Matter. Then later on the day, someone else referenced The Heart of the Matter, so that's why I reread this article. Wait a minute, 2 pairs of glasses. There's the computer glasses. And
I have the same thing, Dave.
Yeah,
got the same thing.
The bifocals for the other 2 applications. Matter and spirit. The Heart of the Matter is actually an autobiography. You're now blurry, but now an autobiographical statement about his theological thought over the years and how it developed. That's just a background. So he's saying matter and spirit, these were no longer 2 things, but 2 states or 2 aspects of one and the same cosmic stuff, according to whether it was looked at or carried further in the direction in which that's not Bergman, it's Bergson. His name keeps popping up. Bergson had put it. It is becoming itself, or in the direction of which it is disintegrated. So this is Teilhard. Everything's either moving forward in this evolutionary process of growth, becoming itself, as I referenced earlier, we're all in the process of becoming ourselves, as God is in the process of becoming God's self, or it's moving in the opposite direction to disintegration and chaos.
Okay. Are you contemplating?
Let me just say, on the next page, he uses the phrase, the progressive spiritualization of matter. There is an almost identical phrase in the 9th chapter of Meditations on the Tarot. And I don't think Tomberg read this, because this particular essay wasn't published until 1976, at which point Tomberg was dead. But Tomberg's what amazed me about reading this is when Tomberg discussing Teilhard, he's coming to the same conclusion that Teilhard is giving retrospectively in this autobiographical comment. So it's giving the impression that Thunberg was really in tune. Were you going to ask another question at this point?
Well, I'm 3 in at this point, so I'm going to go with the last one. The last one that came up was, what do you make of that? When you, yeah, I mean, there's many different ways that you could interpret that, but what do you make of one person having that insight and realization and not being here anymore, and somebody else doesn't have access to it, and they're here in this realm and they're coming to the same realization?
Okay. As I said earlier, I believe God is revealing God's self to all of us all the time. So it's bubbling up. And one thing God says about revelation in the autobiography is God can only reveal what the receiver is prepared to receive at that point in time. So if you will, revelation becomes progressive over time as we kind of our community worldwide understanding builds on what has gone before. But I go off, but so I'm going off on a tangent. But it amazes me because this stuff is so 20th century. And to read mystics from 400 or 500 years ago expressing very similar thoughts. Meister Eckhart, every act reveals God. Every act by us reveals God. All creatures are assisting God in his birth of himself. That's what we're talking about here. Eckhart's at least 500 years ago. And Hafiz, here's God saying, your name completes me. Every soul completes me. So for the deeply mystical, hundreds of years ago, God was already getting through with this thought. So late in the game, in the 1970s, when I started having thoughts like this, well, it's been around for a long time. And of course, living a life of self-doubt, I go, this stuff is too weird and too radical. I can't be right. It doesn't exist anywhere else. Until I read God in Autobiography. Went, oh, not only was I not radical, I wasn't nearly radical enough. And it actually took me a while to digest the higher level of just the whole thought of God says, I am an evolving God. In the book, those are direct quotes. God says, I am a suffering God. And this isn't, well, he says, everyone suffers, including me. So you can add the third quote, I am a sufferer. No, I mean, everyone is imperfect, including me. So you can add the phrase, I am an imperfect God. Well, let me read something. God's talking to Jerry here, but Jerry realizes this is what the Jewish scholar Gershom Scholem explained. And back to reading glasses. Scholem says, the philosophers and theologians were concerned first and foremost with the purity of the concept of God. Skipping down, the price of God's purity is the loss of his living reality. God, on the next page, Jerry hears God saying, pure being is not an abstraction, but a living force focused personally. So this is part of my inherent bias. Intellectual elites, the philosophers, and he said the philosophers and theologians, we have this picture of God being perfect, unmoving, unfeeling, a crystal. Then the non-elite, the average person, the peasants and whatnot, are going about singing praises to God and having a personal relation with God. Who do you think got it right? And then the philosophers and theologians would look at us common folk and say, you're just anthropomorphizing. That's one heck of a big word. And my thought was, if we're created in the image of God, it's not anthropomorphizing, it's reverse engineering.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And God at one point again says to Jerry, you know, all this theories doesn't match the reality on the ground. I am a God who loves, who suffers, who cares, and who is growing alongside my creation.
I'm going to jump in here. So what would you say to somebody that is listening to this, that comes from this more traditional background where there is a dominant, perfect, all-knowing, omnipotent God, which and we're very separate from that, but is feeling like there's something else. There's something else, but they're afraid to even. I remember the first time I even considered learning about that something else, and I thought I would go to hell for that. What would you say to that person who is entering into this with some trepidation because it goes against the very essence of what they've believed up to now?
So let me start with this other one first. Because I'm reading this book and I'm thinking like, I don't know if this is so earth, you know, we have our thoughts of how things work and we defend them strongly because that's important to who we are. And I'm thinking, this is so radically different. How's it going to come across? And getting that unique concept. I have 6 siblings, and we meet every 3 weeks on Zoom to discuss a book, to read a book together. Never occurred to any of us before COVID. We're talking New York, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Virginia, Florida, Missouri. I mean, we don't get together easily. And so my first recommendation with this book, and everybody, they might not agree, but everybody was with it and they kind of liked what was being said, which just surprised me. I like to think I have very open-minded siblings. And then in the course of spiritual direction, there are probably 3 persons I've mentioned the book to, all 3 of whom read it. And all 3 after they read it said, this is one of the best books I've come across, which was very affirming to me. But I had breakfast with a friend who's a fundamentalist Christian and believes you're going to hell if you don't say, I believe in Jesus. I don't see him reading this book. When I became a Protestant around about 1971, I was very much in the evangelical camp. So from the inside, I experienced that group of people of being far more broadly minded than depressed they get. Like everything is the people on the extremes who get all the who get all the express, and that's who we think they are. And so my guess would, a lot of people I know might experience it as an eye-opener. Those who are kind of really secure, I guess, in a rigid place, I don't know.
Mhm.
We never know how God's going to move us, interact with us.
Okay, I have a question. You're talking about people who are rigid and secure. What does it take to soften someone?
Life, experience. But the thing is, in the autobiography, God says things grow by being torn apart and growing back together. And it's usually through some suffering experience that we open up. But that's not our only response. Sometimes we double down and really back into our rigidity. It reminds me of counseling. You have a person who was severely abused as a child, and their behavior is being driven by that. It may be alcoholic behavior, cutting behavior, suicidal behavior. You've got a person who is at risk of death if they don't confront their past abuse. The problem is, if they're not ready to deal with it yet and the counselor tries to force it on them, they may either precipitate to suicide or have the person back so far back down that it may take 5 more years for them to be able to work on it. That makes sense?
It does.
It's a tough thing. And I had a woman who I supervised who worked for me. She just gifted. She got a young woman who's 28 or 29. It's usually about 35 or so before the women are able to deal with the past, just as a rough figure. But the behavior was so suicidal, something had to be done. And this woman could walk the young woman through it. So I'm not sure what, so yeah, so unfortunately the opening experience can lead to reactions in either direction.
I'm curious how we can support individuals in holding them so that they can soften instead of double down or retreat.
Okay, I have opinions on that. I think first we let them have their opinions. Hopefully, if I'm meditating enough, I damp down my need to have other people have my opinions. And I can listen to them. One question, when in a supervisory session for spiritual direction, the question came up, well, the person had these beliefs. How do I counter this belief that looks unhealthy? And the first thing that came to my mind was to say to the person, that seems very important to you. Mm-hmm. And to draw them out to talk about it more. And one thing I've found that it does happen, that if you just keep focusing on the person and trying to understand them more, they might decide they want to understand you more and start asking you questions. Then I think in that case, the response has to be measured. I need to try to say what I say in a way that I believe the other person can hear it. That
Yeah.
makes sense?
Yeah, and I think that's the second part of the experience of spiritual direction, at least for me as a directee, which is that there are places and spaces where you're connected enough with the spirit that we allow for the most compassionate response to come through.
Yeah, and actually, I don't remember the details of what it was, but I remember a time where rather than addressing directly what you said, I said, well, for me, I need to remember so-and-so, that this is it. And your response was, oh yes, I need to rein this in. But I say that because that's a perfect example. Whatever I was thinking, I didn't say you need to rein it in, but I said something in such a way that Bridget was able to say, I need to rein that in. It was a wisdom she had within her. And if I had said something like, well, you really ought to go this way, I just might have engendered all kinds of resistance, which is a big thing that, beginning in the 80s, it goes back to the 80s, but it really came to the surface in the 80s in counseling people in a manner that you're not raising the resistance. We're supposed to be helping them reduce the resistance. So I'm not saying I think Bridget was off base. I didn't know. So I just said where I came from, and Bridget came to her own conclusions.
So we are about 5, maybe 10 minutes max from the end of this conversation. So I'd like to kind of get into final things that any of us want to ask or say, or what's kind of bubbling up. And I would like to ask about your pause. I've noticed that I'm a bit of a bubbly person who tends to like when Bridget and I are talking, we riff. We don't have a lot of pause, and I love your pause. It's very calming. It feels like you're tuning in to something, but I could make my own presumptions about that, and I would like to know more about that process.
I think you just said it quite well in terms of tuning in. I need to get quiet and go inside. Take a moment, and I guess wait for what comes. Which is, I think, hopefully Bridget can affirm that that's kind of a standard practice of mine during spiritual direction. It's what I hope to do. And there's another piece here. So in his first chapter, Thomberg's talking about entering the silence and how, as we enter the silence, we have brief moments of being in the silence, and over time it expands to being minutes and maybe quarters of an hour and even longer, till it becomes a part of us and we enter a zone of silence, when even when we're not meditating, we're walking in the zone of silence. And that can be what we're operating out of. And I didn't realize it until I read Thomberg, but that was my ongoing experience as being an addictions counselor. And I was a clinical supervisor my whole career. I got hired as a clinical supervisor, so I had and it's what I did in supervision. And not the whole story, but you're there, you're with the client, and I haven't got a clue where to go. I don't know what's going on. And so I get quiet. So I'll sit there And out of the silence, the client says something and nails it. I got to tell you, if you don't mind the story.
Absolutely.
We're doing family counseling with a teen who's having addiction issues. Parents are coming, siblings are coming. The one sister will come to she want to have. We had a family therapy room with a couch and whatnot. It was like a conference room set up as a living room. And the younger sister would come, but she didn't want to participate. So she sat in the corner of the room on the floor. And we were going along and something happened. And you get the sense, this is it. Whatever it is, it just entered the room. And I didn't know what it was. I said, okay, what just happened here? And everybody's looking at each other. And what puzzled, but you can tell everybody knows this is it, but we don't know what it is. The 9 or 12-year-old young woman sitting in the corner of the room then told us. And once she said, everybody went, that's it. So just in terms of being in the zone of silence, I often have the experience of talking with somebody, and they're just talking about an issue, and I'm doing my best. This is just a friend. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a spiritual director, but I make a comment. Just because it occurred to me, came there, and the person looks at me, goes, "That's it." So I guess that's kind of how it happens.
Thank you.
I don't think I have anything to add, except that I'd love to read the Hafiz poem that we referenced, if that's all right with everyone.
I love those poems.
Another surprise, this is another book that Dave recommended, and
that, of course, Bridget read.
and that I have.
It's called Each Soul Completes Me. My beloved said, my name is not complete without yours. I thought, how could a human's worth ever be such? And God, knowing all our thoughts, and all our thoughts are innocent steps on the path, then addressed my heart. God revealed a sublime truth to the world when he sang, I am made whole by your life. Each soul completes me.
Process theology in a nutshell.
Anybody
Beautiful.
have anything they want to add onto that?
Seems as good of a place to end as any. I have about 3 hours worth of questions. And like pages of notes.
Yep, pages over here too. Well, beautiful then. I would love to send a special thanks to Asheville artist Melissa Moss for our cover art. You can learn more about Melissa and her work at melissamossart.com. And thank you to Cloud Cult for our music, for the intro and outro. There's so much energy in us. You can find out more about Cloud Cult at cloudcult.com. And of course, friends, thank you for listening. And until next time, peace, love, and light.